The room glittered with polished confidence. Lights spilled from chandeliers like liquid gold, bouncing off glass walls and glossy floors that reflected wealth from every angle. Conversations overlapped in low, practiced tones, numbers, deals, growth, words that carried weight only because the people saying them believed they owned the future. Laughter came easily here, sharp and brief, the kind that didn't linger because there was always something more important to say next. Along the edges of the room, movement happened quietly. Staff in dark uniforms slipped between tables, refilling glasses, collecting used plates, fixing small problems before anyone important noticed. Among them was a man pushing a cleaning cart that squeaked faintly each time it rolled over a seam in the floor. He moved carefully, eyes trained on what others missed: crumbs near chair legs, a smudge on polished marble, a napkin dropped beneath a table where expensive shoes rested. He had worked nights like this for years. Fancy events, important people, rooms that looked like they belonged in magazines. He knew the rhythm well: arrive early, stay invisible, leave late. He had learned how to fold himself smaller without meaning to, how to keep his face neutral so no one felt the need to acknowledge him. It wasn't bitterness that kept him quiet. It was habit. At the front of the room stood a grand piano, its black surface gleaming under the lights, lid raised like it was waiting for something. It hadn't been played all evening. It was there for show, a symbol of class, of refinement, of culture curated to impress donors and executives alike. People passed it without a glance, more interested in the stage behind it where speeches would soon begin. As the man wiped a faint scuff mark near the piano's base, a cluster of voices nearby grew louder. A group of executives stood laughing, jackets loosened, drinks half finished. The night was going well. The schedule had slipped a few minutes, and there was a lull before the next speaker. Someone glanced at the piano. Someone else followed his gaze. A smile spread, slow and careless. "Well," one of them said, loud enough to carry, "we've got a piano just sitting there." Another chuckled. "Yeah, shame to let it go to waste." Their eyes drifted, not to each other, but to the man kneeling near the piano, cloth in hand, uniform plain and worn compared to the tailored suits around him. "Hey!" the first voice called out, amusement dripping from the word. "You play?" The question landed harder than it sounded. The man froze for a fraction of a second before standing up. He straightened, still holding the cloth, and shook his head once, small and controlled. "I'm just cleaning, sir," he said quietly. A few people laughed. Not cruelly, they would have said later. Just enough to fill the space. "Oh, come on," another voice added. "Relax. We're waiting anyway. Give us a little music." More eyes turned. Some curious. Some uncomfortable. Some already lifting phones, sensing entertainment. The man felt heat creep up his neck. He had felt this before, not this exact moment, but this feeling. Being seen not as a person, but as a prop. A break from boredom. "I don't think," he started, but the sentence never finished. "Don't be shy," someone said. "You're standing right there. It's perfect." The group laughed again, louder this time, the sound echoing against glass and marble. Around them, conversation slowed. Attention shifted. A few guests exchanged glances, unsure whether to intervene or enjoy the spectacle. The man looked down at his hands. They were steady, but only because he forced them to be. Inside, something old stirred, memories he usually kept locked away. A room much smaller than this one. A piano with chipped keys. Long nights spent practicing when the world felt quieter and kinder. He swallowed and took a small step back, instinct urging him to return to his cart, to disappear into the edges where he belonged. That had always worked before. But the laughter didn't fade. It hung there, expectant. "Seriously," the first man said, waving toward the bench. "What's the harm? We could all use a laugh." A laugh. That was what this was supposed to be. The man felt the weight of the room press in on him. Every instinct told him to walk away. To apologize. To pretend he hadn't heard. But something else rose up too, something stubborn, something tired of always shrinking. He set the cloth down on the piano's edge. The sound of it touching the polished surface was soft, but it felt impossibly loud to him. A ripple passed through the nearby crowd. Whispers began, low and quick. Is he actually? No way. This is awkward. He pulled the bench back and sat down. The seat was colder than he expected. For a moment, he simply sat there, hands resting on his knees, staring at the keys. They looked different under these lights, too clean, too perfect. He hadn't touched a piano like this in years. Behind him, someone snorted. Another voice said, "This is already worth it." His heart pounded. He could feel it in his throat, in his ears. He told himself he didn't have to do this. He could stand up at any moment. He could turn it back into their joke and walk away. Instead, he placed his fingers gently on the keys. The room held its breath, though many didn't realize it yet. Phones tilted. Smiles widened, waiting for the wrong note, the proof that this had been ridiculous all along. He closed his eyes, not in confidence, but in self-defense. For a second, he wasn't in the ballroom anymore. He was somewhere quieter. Somewhere safe. Then he pressed the first key. The note was soft. Almost too soft to hear. A few people leaned in, confused. He pressed another. Then another. The laughter faltered, replaced by a ripple of uncertainty. This wasn't noise. This wasn't chaos. It was controlled. Intentional. The melody began to form slowly, like a thought finding words. It was simple at first, hesitant, as if testing whether it was allowed to exist in this room. His shoulders loosened slightly. His breathing steadied. The whispers grew quieter. A woman near the back frowned, phone lowering. "Wait," she murmured. "This is good." The man at the piano didn't hear her. He was somewhere else now, guided by muscle memory and emotion he hadn't named in years. His fingers moved with care, drawing sound that filled the space between tables, slipping past glass and steel and ego. The tune deepened, richer now, carrying something heavier beneath its surface. A few smiles faded. People shifted in their seats. The executives who had started it all exchanged looks, amusement giving way to confusion. This wasn't the joke they planned. As the music spread, the room began to change, though no one could point to the exact moment it happened. Conversation stopped. Glasses lowered. Even the staff paused in their movements, drawn toward the sound. At the head of the room, someone important, someone used to command and control, looked up sharply, attention captured without permission. The man at the piano played on, unaware of the shift he was causing, unaware that the room had already begun to turn against its own assumptions. And as the melody grew stronger, the laughter that had pushed him here faded completely, leaving behind a silence charged with something none of them had expected. The silence that followed the first movement was not comfortable. It was tight, stretched thin across the room like a wire pulled too far. People shifted in their seats, suddenly aware of their own breathing, their own stillness. What had begun as amusement had turned into something harder to categorize, and uncertainty made many of them uneasy. A few near the back tried to recover the mood with soft chuckles, but the sound died quickly. It felt wrong now, like laughing during a confession. The man at the piano kept playing, eyes closed, shoulders rising and falling with the rhythm. His hands no longer hesitated. They moved with purpose, pressing the keys as if each note carried weight he had been holding for years. The melody deepened, bending towards something raw and intimate, something that did not belong to a room built on polished surfaces and rehearsed smiles. Someone whispered, "This wasn't supposed to happen." Another voice answered, barely audible, "I think he's actually good." Actually. The word landed quietly but carried a sharp edge. Near the group of executives who had called him up, faces tightened. One man took a long drink, eyes darting around as if searching for reassurance that he still controlled the moment. Another crossed his arms, jaw clenched, discomfort replacing earlier confidence. "This is getting awkward," someone muttered. The music swelled again, and the awkwardness turned into exposure. The notes were no longer tentative. They rolled through the room with confidence, weaving sorrow and restraint into something powerful enough to command attention without asking for it. A woman near the front wiped at her eyes, surprised to find moisture there. She frowned at herself, as if offended by her own reaction. This was supposed to be a networking event. Not this. Behind the piano, a staff member stood frozen, tray balanced on one hand, completely forgotten. The room that had been full of motion minutes earlier now felt suspended, as if time itself had slowed to listen. But not everyone listened with openness. A man near the bar leaned toward his companion. "Who does he think he is?" he whispered. "This isn't his place." The words were quiet, but the sentiment echoed through the room in subtler ways. Tight smiles, restless movements, eyes that refused to fully meet what was happening. For some, the discomfort came not from the music itself, but from what it suggested. Talent where they had not expected it. Depth where they had assumed emptiness. At the piano, the man felt the shift even without seeing it. He sensed the tension in the air, the way the silence pressed against the music now. His chest tightened. Doubt crept in, whispering that he had gone too far. That he should have stopped earlier, left them with something light and forgettable. His fingers faltered for a fraction of a second. In that moment, memory surged forward uninvited. A much younger version of himself standing on a stage, lights too bright, heart racing. A judge's voice telling him he had potential, but lacked polish. A scholarship that almost came through, then didn't. Bills that didn't care about potential. A mother's tired smile as she told him it was okay to be practical. The melody darkened. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. What had been reflective became heavier, carrying frustration and regret. The piano seemed to protest under his hands, sound swelling with emotion that had never been given a place to go. A man near the stage frowned. "Is this appropriate?" he murmured. Someone else shrugged. "It's intense." At the head table, the most powerful figure in the room sat unmoving, eyes fixed on the pianist. This was not the kind of intensity usually allowed here. Boardrooms preferred control, predictability. But something in the music bypassed those preferences entirely, reaching places that strategy never touched. The man at the piano leaned forward slightly, as if pulled closer by the sound he was creating. His shoulders trembled once, then steadied. He did not look up. If he looked up now, he might stop. A phone slipped from someone's hand and clattered softly to the floor. No one laughed. No one commented. The sound felt intrusive, almost disrespectful. Near the back, one of the executives who had started it all cleared his throat. "All right," he said, attempting a light tone. "That's probably enough, yeah?" The words cut through the music like a blade. For a split second, the pianist's hands hovered over the keys. The room seemed to lean forward, waiting to see which way he would fall. Obedience. Or defiance. His fingers came down harder than before. The music surged, louder now, fuller, filling the space with sound that left no room for interruption. The executive's mouth fell open slightly, shock replacing authority. A few heads turned toward him, irritation flashing across their faces. "Let him finish," someone whispered sharply. The pianist felt heat rise behind his eyes, but he blinked it back. This wasn't anger. It was release. Each chord felt like breathing after being underwater too long. The notes climbed, then broke into a cascade that felt almost violent in its honesty. The room was no longer merely listening. It was being confronted. A woman near the aisle pressed her hand to her chest, breath catching. "Why does this feel like he's telling a story?" she murmured. Because he was. Without words, the music spoke of nights spent choosing responsibility over desire. Of hands that cleaned floors instead of playing keys. Of applause imagined but never received. Of dignity maintained quietly in spaces that never offered recognition. Some people shifted uncomfortably, sensing accusation where none was spoken. Others leaned forward, pulled closer despite themselves. The executive who had tried to stop it glanced around, suddenly aware that he was no longer the center of attention. His face flushed. He forced a laugh that went unanswered. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction now. The pianist's hands moved faster, confidence surging with every measure. His back straightened. His presence grew. He was no longer a man borrowed for a joke. He was the room's gravity. At the head table, a breath hitched. The powerful listener there did not move to hide it. Eyes glistened, jaw tightening as the music struck something long buried beneath years of control and calculation. The melody softened again, easing into something fragile, almost tender. It felt like standing at the edge of a truth too personal to say aloud. The room leaned into it, collectively holding its breath. The pianist's hands slowed, hovering between notes. The final chord of this movement approached, and with it, a decision. He could end here. Leave them suspended, unsettled, unsure what to do with what they'd felt. As his fingers pressed down one last time, drawing out a lingering sound that trembled through the air, the room remained frozen. The note faded, but the tension did not. Everyone knew something irreversible had begun. And no one yet knew how it would end. The final chord dissolved slowly, not disappearing so much as thinning out, like breath on cold glass. No one clapped. No one spoke. The silence that followed was heavier than the one before, weighted with the kind of awareness that made people sit straighter without knowing why. The man at the piano kept his hands resting on the keys, fingers still curved, as if the music might return if he let go too soon. His chest rose and fell in measured breaths. He could feel the room now, really feel it, the tension, the attention, the unspoken question hanging in the air. He had crossed a line, though no sign marked where it was. Somewhere near the back, a chair scraped softly against the floor. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Heads turned instinctively, then settled again, embarrassed by the interruption. It was as if the room itself demanded reverence. He finally lifted his hands from the piano and let them fall to his lap. The keys gleamed back at him, innocent and unbothered, as though they hadn't just carried years of his life into the open. He swallowed, unsure whether to stand or wait, unsure of what he was allowed to do now. Then someone stood. The movement came from the head table, slow and deliberate. A tall figure pushed back his chair, the faint scrape cutting through the stillness. Conversations had bent around this man all evening, orbiting him with careful smiles and rehearsed respect. He rarely stood without purpose. Every eye followed him as he walked toward the stage. The pianist noticed the shift immediately. He opened his eyes at last and saw the man approaching, suit immaculate, posture rigid, expression unreadable. His pulse quickened. This was it, he thought. The moment the spell broke. The correction. The reminder of where he belonged. The footsteps stopped a few feet away. Up close, the man's face looked older than the photographs and annual reports suggested. Lines marked the corners of his eyes. His gaze lingered on the piano, then lifted to the pianist's face. "What is your name?" he asked. The question was simple, but it landed with unexpected weight. The pianist hesitated, then answered softly. He nodded once, as if committing the sound to memory. "How long have you worked here?" "Almost 12 years. A murmur passed through the crowd. 12 years. People did quick mental math, fitting the number into their own timelines. The man looked back at the piano. "And before that?" The pianist's hands tightened slightly on his knees. He could feel eyes pressing in from every direction now, curiosity sharpened by the promise of revelation. He hadn't planned for this part. He had only planned to play. "I studied music," he said after a moment. "A long time ago." The words felt fragile, exposed. He waited for the follow-up he feared, the one that would reduce everything back to trivia. Instead, the man said quietly, "Where?" The answer came out before he could stop it. The name of the conservatory. The scholarship that never fully materialized. The program he left halfway through. A few people gasped softly. Others exchanged looks, reassessing what they thought they knew. The man at the piano added, almost apologetically, "I had to help my family. Things changed." The man in the suit nodded again, slower this time. His throat worked as if he were swallowing something difficult. "I've sat in rooms like this for 30 years. he said, turning slightly so his voice carried. I've listened to speeches about talent, about investment, about recognizing potential. He paused, eyes returning to the pianist. Tonight I realized how often we fail to recognize it when it's right in front of us. The room felt smaller somehow, more intimate, as if the walls had drawn in closer to listen. The pianist shifted on the bench, discomfort creeping in. Praise made him uneasy. It always had. It asked something of him, hope, maybe, that he wasn't sure he could afford anymore. The man continued, voice steadier now. When you began playing, I thought of the first piano I ever heard. Not in a concert hall. In a public school auditorium with broken heaters and folding chairs. I remember thinking that sound didn't belong there. He smiled faintly. I was wrong. It belonged everywhere. A breath hitched in his chest. The room noticed. Someone near the aisle wiped at their eyes without shame now. Others sat frozen, caught between admiration and guilt. The pianist felt his own defenses cracking. He hadn't intended to be seen like this, hadn't meant to pull stories out of people who never offered them freely. His gaze dropped to the floor, but the man's voice followed him. You didn't play to impress us, he said. You played because you had something to say. The pianist looked up despite himself. That takes courage, the man added. Especially in a place that rarely listens. The words settled deep, stirring something painful and bright all at once. Courage. No one had used that word for him in years. The man extended his hand. The gesture shocked the room. A few people inhaled sharply. The pianist stared at the hand for a split second, then stood quickly and took it, grip firm but uncertain. The handshake was brief, but it carried weight. Cameras flashed, not the discreet, mocking kind from earlier, but open, intentional ones. This was no longer a joke. I'd like to talk with you, the man said, releasing his hand. Not tonight. Tonight belongs to this moment. He glanced around the room. But soon. The pianist nodded, throat tight, unsure what to say without cheapening it. The man turned back to the crowd. I think we've been reminded why art matters, he said. It doesn't ask permission. It reveals. Applause broke out then, not the roaring kind yet, but steady, respectful. It grew as people stood, one by one, until the sound filled the room, washing over the pianist in waves. He stood there, overwhelmed, hands at his sides, unsure where to put the feeling rising in his chest. He caught fragments of whispered conversation as the clapping continued. I had no idea. Did you see his hands? That music felt like memory. As the applause finally softened, the pianist took a step back from the piano, heart still racing. He felt exposed, but not small. For the first time in a long while, he felt tall. The man in the suit met his eyes one last time and nodded, a silent promise passing between them. As the crowd slowly began to breathe again, the pianist knew something had shifted. Not just in the room, but in himself. The door he'd closed years ago, carefully, painfully, had cracked open. And whatever waited on the other side was closer now than it had ever been. The applause faded gradually, like a tide pulling back from shore, leaving behind a charged quiet that felt different from before. It wasn't the awkward silence of uncertainty anymore. It was reflective, heavy with meaning. People remained standing longer than necessary, as if sitting down too soon would somehow undo what had just happened. The pianist stepped away from the bench, unsure where to go. His instincts told him to return to the edges of the room, to find his cart, to become invisible again. But his legs didn't move in that direction. Instead, he stood near the piano, hands loosely clasped, feeling hundreds of eyes on him without the sting they once carried. Someone approached cautiously, then another. A woman who had laughed earlier now looked at him with something close to reverence. That was extraordinary, she said, her voice quieter than before. I'm sorry. I didn't realize. He nodded, accepting the words without knowing what to do with them. Apologies had never come easily in rooms like this. Nearby, the executives who had started it all stood apart from the gathering crowd. Their earlier confidence had drained away, replaced by stiff smiles and restless movements. One of them cleared his throat, attempting to regain footing. "Well," he said too loudly, "that certainly wasn't what I expected." No one laughed. The realization settled over him slowly, painfully. The joke had slipped from his hands. It no longer belonged to him. The room had chosen differently. At the head table, the powerful man remained standing, watching the pianist as people spoke to him, thanked him, praised him. There was no triumph in his expression, only thoughtfulness. He saw something familiar in the man's posture, the careful humility, the instinct to deflect attention. He had worn it himself once. As the crowd thinned slightly, he approached again, not with ceremony this time, but with quiet intention. "You should know," he said, voice low. "We have a foundation tied to this company. It funds arts programs, scholarships. I've spoken about it often. Tonight I realized I haven't listened closely enough." The pianist looked at him, uncertain. "I didn't play for that," he said gently. "I know," the man replied. "That's why it matters." They stood in silence for a moment, the noise of the room resuming cautiously around them. Glasses clinked again. Conversations restarted, but they were different now, less polished, more human. Across the room, someone watched the pianist with narrowed eyes, discomfort hardening into resentment. It wasn't fair, he thought. Not the attention. Not the emotion. Not the way the night had tilted away from what it was supposed to be. He muttered something under his breath and turned back to his drink, unwilling to confront the unease gnawing at him. But others did confront it. A young intern approached the pianist hesitantly. "I just wanted to say, I almost quit music," she said. "I thought it was impractical. Watching you, I don't know. It reminded me why I started." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried gratitude without promise. "Hold on to it," he said. "As long as you can." Time moved forward, slowly reasserting itself. The event continued, but it never fully returned to what it had been. The piano no longer felt like decoration. People passed it with a glance now, some with a nod, as if acknowledging a witness. When the final speeches ended and guests began to leave, the pianist retrieved his cart from where he'd left it earlier. The squeaking wheel sounded louder in the quieter room. He expected to feel small again. Instead, the cart felt lighter. As he moved through the emptying space, the man from the head table caught up to him once more. "I meant what I said," he told him. "I'd like to hear you play again. Properly. On your terms." The pianist nodded, emotion tightening his throat. "Thank you. Thank you," the man corrected gently. They shook hands once more, not as spectacle, but as equals acknowledging something shared. Later, when the room had emptied and only staff remained, the pianist finished his work in silence. Chairs stacked. Tables cleared. Lights dimmed. The piano sat quietly in the corner, lid lowered now, as if resting after a long confession. As he wiped the last surface and prepared to leave, he paused beside it. He placed a hand on the cool wood, not to play, but to acknowledge it. For years, he had avoided moments like this, afraid of reopening wounds. Tonight had shown him that some wounds didn't need to stay closed forever. He walked out into the night air, the city humming softly around him. For the first time in a long while, the future did not feel like something already decided. Back upstairs, long after he'd gone, someone stood alone by the piano, thinking about a joke that had turned into a reckoning. About laughter that had given way to listening. About how easy it was to overlook greatness when it didn't arrive wearing the right clothes. The lesson lingered in the quiet room like an echo. What began as an attempt to humiliate had ended as a reminder. Talent does not ask permission, dignity does not announce itself, and sometimes the most powerful music comes from the people the world taught itself not to hear.